Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Mariann Vaczi. Hello, Toby. Thank you for having me. I'm zooming in or talking to you here from Reno, Nevada, and we have a magnificent snowstorm. Everything is shut down, so everyone is at home.
so no one can get a quick divorce today.
No, no. I suppose even those offices are shut down.
Well, Prof, it's a really great honor and privilege to be talking to you. I was just telling you before we started recording how influential your work has been on me and on collaborators of mine. Because I live in the global South, I don't have access to your books. So my questions are informed by what I know about your articles, right? And only some of them, but of course want to have you talk about your books as well. And I want to begin with my stereotypical query that I pose to everyone, which is to ask what's currently impeding, preoccupying, dynamizing, interesting you. What's going on for Prof V?
Yes, this sounds like the scariest question of all.
It is.
But you mean besides digging us out of this snowstorm, the immediate concern? Yes, I think what generally preoccupies me is personally, I'm in a fine place. I am, however, highly bicontinental, and this kind of gives me a fractured habitus of having to be here, there, everywhere. I'm from Eastern Europe. I have very strong family links there. I go there all the time. I visit, but of course, my field site is in my field sites are in Spain, the Basque country, and Catalonia mostly, and I work in the United States. Here in Nevada at the University of Nevada in Reno, and that's a kind of constant juggling to find time for everyone, for my friends, and I'm very big on maintaining friendships, and so and so I kind of compulsively travel to these places, and of course family ties. Also, I'm getting to a good place in terms of having a mental space, and rather hunger to start my new book project, which will I'm going on sabbatical next year, and thank you, and um, and this is only important because I'm kind of coming out of a sort of burnout, a sort of writer's burnout, which I also call my post tenure torpor. When you kind of after a very intensive period of scrambling publications to finish for your tenure, I just spent months reading novels after that, and I was wondering, am I going to get back my writing mojo, my writing hunger? I think that's a predicament for kind of all writer types, and I'm happy to see that I'm ready.
I went up for tenure when you were, in elementary school, uh, probably at NYU. And I had a virtual file called Tenure, into which I was trying to produce materials that would make my case, and I couldn't do it. One day I mistyped over the name of the file, and it changed from tenure to manure. And from
Oh,
that point on, everything fell into place, so to speak. It's just really easy.
just that was your little ritual of degradation, and it suddenly became a different thing and more manageable, right? I mean, these things are difficult, and writing is difficult. That's one of my obsession is, have you read Orin Stern? Stern had this wonderful essay titled "The Miseries of Anthropological Writing." In it, in
No.
it, he writes about just so hard to complete these projects, dissertations, junior professors writing books for their tenure, and how writing. He brings in the statistics of how 10% write smoothly. I'm luckily one of those 10%. 80% struggle and suffer. and then 10% become suicidal.
Well, you know,
So I think tenure is always, it's no wonder it's a sort of rite of passage.
I think that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And for some people, it is torture. It's really torture. And that's okay if they find themselves in a little liberal arts college or in a, in inverted commas, teaching university. But even there nowadays in the US, there's pressure to publish. I had many years after NYU in the University of California system. But during the period that I was there, the California state system, which is not Research One, saw expectations that everybody publish up the wazoo, which was crazy given their teaching loads. So I think there's a real tendency, but it's a problem towards this. And it makes for lots of manuscripts that are about tiny, unimportant things with 27,000 authors saying nothing but obey all the rules. In sports, this is hugely true of the NCAA. Rubbish about college sports. You know, should it be okay to have a grade point average of 2.7 or 2.6 and be allowed to stay in the football program? You know, endless, iterations of the same stuff, really demoralizing when the big questions don't get asked. Now, that said, Prof, I've got a big question for you, if I may. And it concerns one of your articles that's a little bit about your own split subjectivity.
Oh.
And it's the American dream in post-socialist Hungary.
Very good. You
about
picked that one.
Hungarian girl meets Yankee boy. Everybody's wonderful. Everything's fantastic until it isn't, until not everybody's wonderful and not everything's fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about that in terms of post-socialism and the so-called American dream?
Right. So that article was the center of that article is a couple. The woman, the wife is a 3 times Olympic champion swimmer, Katinka Hossu, and her husband Shane Tassap, who is an American man whom she met while she swam at the University of California, University of Southern California, and they got married. And she was just about to kind of stop swimming because the results didn't come. And he started coaching her, and they became extremely successful. He devised a coaching methodology by which they basically trained by racing. So she made a lot of money. Apparently, she was an athlete who made more money in swimming than Michael Phelps, not counting commercial endorsements and advertising. Anyway, so this couple erupted in the Hungarian public sphere. Obviously, she being a Hungarian national competing for Hungary, it was a huge sensation, and him being the support personnel, right? He was the coach, but he was also the husband, and everybody was admiring their success. They were extremely successful. And so I looked at in that article how the presence of an American man impacted Hungarian discourse, and how his difference put our difference into relief, and it went back all the way to kind of these post-socialist transformations and mentalities, and particularly a couple of things. What he brought in is what we would call this big American self-confidence, right? And that was very unfamiliar from a Hungarian perspective. This kind of what we would consider kind of bragging and overly self-confident. But athletes say, and particularly Hungarian athletes or Eastern European athletes who had studied in the United States, that this kind of mentality is actually very helpful, because in Europe, in Eastern Europe, kind of manage your expectations mentality prevails. And so they could benefit hugely, and Katinka Hossu benefited hugely through through her husband's self-confidence, and of course then it became a situation of transference and the self-fulfilling prophecy that he projected on her career. And of course it also called attention, just the husband's modus operandi of being very assertive and going after things, and basically have this unshakable belief in themselves, which put the two cultures, and including the culture of swimming, in relief.
This is really interesting to me because I grew up with all sorts of myths about Hungarian sport.
Mm-hmm.
Myths based on real events. I'm thinking of Hungary disgracing England twice at football in the 50s, 7-1, 6-3, I think. And then especially during the Soviet occupation in 56, the famous water polo match at the Olympics,
right,
won by Hungary. And so for me, there was a romantic association with Hungarian sports from the 50s that was quite different from the automaton model that we had as a stereotype in the West about Soviet athletes, about East German swimmers in particular. And of course, we now know the horrors that those women in particular were put through in East German swimming. But there was this notion of nationalism and cavalier joy that seemed to suffuse the football team in the 50s, and of course, that extraordinary water polo team. I wondered if you could talk a bit about socialist Hungary, post-socialist Hungary in sports in terms of joy versus regimentation, that sort of opposition. Yeah.
In terms of joy, that's interesting, precisely because we kind of consider ourselves our national stereotypical national self-characterization is kind of dour, and our national anthem is emphasizing all this misery of 1,000 years, but you're right, for Hungarians, sport is one of the few terrains where you kind of get international visibility. And another one perhaps is lately the Nobel Prize was awarded to Hungarian authors, so we are kind of strong in that round too. But we have this idea of small sport, big performance, and or big achievement, and of course the government currently and also in the past. And socialist governments always put money into these behind these achievements because they had great geopolitical importance. And concerning those times that you mentioned, 50s, 60s, there is a topic I think that I keep flirting with, and I will eventually do regarding Hungarian sport during communism. And that is this paradoxical situation where athletes couldn't travel. Nobody could travel, right? I mean, I'm sorry, people couldn't travel out of the communist bloc. Only athletes could with special permission to international races. And athletes would disappear. They just miss their train or miss their flight. They went to the bathroom, they never emerged again, never checked in. Those kinds of stories. That whole team, the water polo team that you mentioned in Melbourne, they disappeared. They scattered in there. They stopped. Yeah, they. That was the only time to defect. That was the only way to defect from Hungary, and they settled in these countries. And so I think one very interesting research project would be to look at how state security was trying to control these athletes. Imagine an Olympic delegation or a world championship somewhere else, and the Hungarian team consisting of so many members, half of them are state informers, monitoring what the athletes are talking about at breakfast and whether they are trying to defect or not. And I find that kind of informer culture in Hungary and other post-Soviet, like Eastern European countries, I think is still a big trauma, and it's not properly processed, I should say. There are artistic examples which are addressing the problem of informers in communist countries, and how demoralizing that was from the perspective of social solidarity and the social fabric.
I once had a master's degree class that was mostly comprised of folks from Bhutan, which is often heralded by the soft left because it talks about gross domestic happiness, not product.
Mm-hmm.
Every one of them was paid by the state to spy on Facebook pages held by other Bhutanese, and that's how they funded their overseas study. And
right.
they say this with big smiles on their faces. So, Prof.
I'm sorry, I didn't end up talking about joy. See?
Well, someone had to mention it, and it's probably symptomatic that I was the one who did. And what do I know?
But we do enjoy our sports. It's something that does bring us a lot of joy. It does bring a lot of social and political controversy too, as it should, where the government and taxpaying monies go to certain directions, and people criticize those directions and say, why don't they go into other directions? So
now, you mentioned the next book project. I wondered if you could fill us in a bit about that. It sounds exciting.
Yes, so I want to return to football after my work in Catalonia on traditional sports, and my plan is to go off grid in Spain and write another monograph with a tentative title of Football, Capitalism, and Desire: An Anthropology of the Beautiful Game, something like that. And I will touch upon some of the usual topics, such as the geopolitics of football in Spain. But I also want to kind of go after, I'm brainstorming about less beaten paths. For example, how does I'm interested in going to South America, let's say, and find one of these youth academies, visit one of these youth academies, for example, in Argentina, and look at that episode, that part of global football, through the eyes of the ojeador, the person who recruits children, who goes to different youth academies, and they watch children and they pick them out potentially. And so I want to kind of look at it as the gaze of capitalism, the gaze of the ojeador, and how those children are singled out, how are they picked, and what kind of desires they generate in the local community through the obviously the parents, the coaches, this kind of local desiring economies that global football generates. So that would be, for example, one idea. Another one is referees. Nobody writes about referees, or do they?
Not really. I mean, I was interested the other day. I was listening to a podcast from Britain about football that had a quiz component, and the experts participating in the quiz were asked to name 3 current referees in the English Premier League. No one could. Even though they talk every week about refereeing and how bad it is, they know nothing about who these people are. And for me, that's
exactly. I mean, that's exactly the hallmark of a job well done in refereeing. Yes. Because you want to be invisible, right? You want to be invisible, and if you have done your job, people don't even remember you. If you have done your job well, people don't remember your name because there's no controversy. And of course, on account of that, questions such as the video refereeing could be brought in. The general what I could call the kind of general disenchantment of the play sphere through all kinds of techniques of rationalization. The video referee could be something like that. What kind of, will we have myths like the hand of God goal anymore if there is video referee, right? So questions like that, a little bit the unexamined, because football has been written about in so many ways. And of course, I want to bring in anthropological lenses. And then I also want to bring in the concept of desire and capitalism a little bit into elite football in Spain. And this is coming from, one of those questions. Capitalism in sport and everywhere is we see it as it's an acknowledged evil, right? We know that it's destructive. We keep mentioning that it's going to result in collapses, implosions of the economy, and somehow it still has this very profound staying power. And so what I like to look at is how, inspired by different authors coming from psychoanalysis, is how desire, our desiring, engages with capitalist desiring, and how capitalism and sport are very similar in a way that they have this logical similar structure, that they keep us being desiring subjects, and they keep flashing commodities to us that we want. We want titles, we want victories, we want a new player, we want flashy coaches. And so it has this seduction of the promise where we long for things, but the moment we get them, they kind of start losing their allure, and we start wanting something else. We want the next one.
Talking about my marriages, are you, Prof?
Yes, this is why, both capitalism and sport engages our libidinal lives. It's a libidinal economy. And I think it's interesting to look at this through sport, because we have criticized capitalism in so many ways through, its hegemonies, its exploitations, its economic inequalities, but we haven't really looked at how its staying power is due to how effectively it engages with the way we desire in all realms of life.
Can I
not just
a moment there, Prof? First of all, to apologize to any ex-girlfriends who are listening.
Sorry.
I was joking.
And interrupt me, because I can go on tangents.
No. But more seriously, on the point you're making, Luis Vegaras, great Mexican anthropologist of inequality, has talked about there being different capitalisms. And in sports, it seems to me, there's the very managed corporate capitalism in the United States that's quite different from the spirit of football in most of the world, because there's no relegation. There's no reality for these right-wing Republican men who own all the baseball teams, who own all the so-called football teams, who own all the hockey teams, right? So when they go elsewhere, and as you know, in English Premier League now, there's a huge amount of US ownership. The first thing that worries them is relegation, because they've never experienced competitive capitalism. They've never experienced the laissez-faire fantasy of new entrants who can compete. Exactly what we're seeing at the moment with artificial intelligence, and what we've seen over the last 30 years with the internet. Big US platforms that don't know how to compete. They wouldn't have a clue. They've never done it.
Right. So isn't it interesting that the system, capitalism, that supposedly thrives on competition, actively eliminates competition by creating these spheres? And it's suffice it to think of the 2021 idea of the European Super League, which you surely remember, and the giant, the big indignation that created, and obviously partly because of just the sheer blatant shamelessness of creating a sphere which is not even competitive anymore in that sense of relegation
doing away
versus
with
not.
But what's interesting too, Prof, and I'd love your take on this, because I think it is relevant to your project, if you don't mind my saying so. I mean, how do I know? You're the expert. That was hailed by lots of romantic leftists as a moment of the eruption into power of desire on the part of the audience. You know, Liverpool fans saying, how dare you do this? Barca fans the same. This is nonsense. The designers of the European Super League didn't cut deals with television. They didn't work out that what they needed to do first was organize things with the major players who were plowing billions of euros into these leagues based on TV rights. Now, okay, without a doubt, their long-term notion is to become their own broadcasters, right? That they don't need to sell the rights to anybody. They are the rights holders, and they charge all of us a mint to watch. But at the time, the reason it collapsed, I think, was precisely because they didn't do due diligence, and the romantic notions of fan power are
Right.
action.
Oh, that's something I actually have to look into it, because then it's extra shameless.
A rupture in the ruling class is really what.
Yes, right, because then it becomes extra cynical in a way that you can't even have that romantic narrative.
I'm sorry, Prof.
No, I mean, listen, everybody knows that the writing is on the wall. And I think people think that this is going to happen, or maybe in some other shape or form. But these kind of infringements of capitalism are becoming unavoidable.
And the interesting thing, it also what you talk about makes me think about baseball, because as you know, the major league clubs have schools, in inverted commas, all over Latin America in order to basically sign on young men, potentially talented at the age of about 8 or 12, and then provide them with schooling and a place to live up until they injure themselves or they prove not to be quite as good as was expected, and then they're out. But meanwhile, parental desires, young pupil desires are engaged massively, right, with the possibility of transcendence. But as I say, thrown on a scrap heap tomorrow, if need be.
I'm sorry, what was the last sentence?
Thrown on a scrap heap tomorrow, if need be.
Right. I mean, that's precisely one of the questions I would like to go after. These kinds of what happens to a little boy singled out in a, let's say, not first world country. There's a very good book by an anthropologist called Peter Benson, who wrote a book titled Broccoli and Desire. He also has a co-author whose name I forget, and they trace the path of broccoli from its production site, Guatemala, onto the tables of American middle class families, and of course broccoli with its wonderful greenness being the ultimate symbol of middle class health, consciousness, and well-being. And so you could actually do that. And this shows the commodification of children and players. You could actually do that with a child player.
Well, I'm thinking of
follow them out of their natural environment and how they are produced into footballers there, onto their new.
Well, I'm thinking of Alan Klein's book Sugar Ball about the Republic, which is the sort of baseball example of this. But the broccoli book I have to get hold of by hook, crook, or vegetable.
It's fantastic.
They're possible next projects. Can you tell us about your extant books? You've edited and you've also authored books, and I've not been able to get hold of them. I've only read your articles. So could you educate me and possibly listeners about those books?
I will have to send you dedicated versions of my monographs, because those are okay. So my first monograph was, and I write ethnographies. My first ethnography came out in 2015. It grew out of my doctoral dissertation, and that work was, it's called Soccer, Culture and Society in Spain, an ethnography of Basque fandom. And that book was based on my almost 2-year long ethnographic fieldwork in Bilbao. And Bilbao is a very unique place from the perspective of sport culture, football history. You know, they call themselves a unique case in the world of football, and that is because they have this unique fielding policy or signing policy. They play only with Basque players. And so for me as a PhD student in anthropology, my questions were, okay, this is interesting. What does that mean? What does it mean, Basque player? How is that defined? And how has it been defined for the last 100 years? And how does it interact with, of course, in the broader geopolitical context of Spain? How does it interact with Spanish identities from the perspective of Basque nationalism, Basque nation building? And so I investigated these basic identity questions for this book, and it's my I think my very basic question for my books has been how the political emerges through sports, how the body becomes politicized, and how politics becomes embodied. And here you have individual football players who were in Bilbao, whose pedigrees and ancestry is actively debated. Each time a new signing emerges on the horizon, they debate Basqueness. Where was this person born? Where were they raised? Do they speak Basque, the Basque language, and so on? Because this philosophy stipulates, they call it a philosophia. It stipulates that you can be signed by Bilbao if you were either born or raised in one of the Basque academies. And so this reduces their recruitment pool to 2.5 million people. And they compete with this pool. And by the way, they share this pool with 4 or 5 other first division clubs in the Spanish Liga. And so this is a very small and limited pool of basically homegrown players competing against the Galacticos, because they share the same league with Real Madrid and Football Club Barcelona. So it was a real enjoyable story. And of course I came, which is the pleasure of ethnography, is its serendipity and how you encounter unexpected things. And for example, I wrote about fans spreading the ashes of their dead relatives and other dead fans in the playing field, and how that becomes a kind of new expression of how we think of death and how we think of sport and sporting spaces. So that was my first book. Do you want me to proceed to the second one, or you prefer to ask a question?
No, let's get the books out of the way, and then I can interrogate you on Euskera.
Okay. So, and then after this book, I was in a desperate place because I didn't have a job. I got my PhD, I published my book, no job. I was between jobs, as we could say. And I thought, well, I need to diversify. I want to go back to Catalonia and look at football the same way. Because in Catalonia in the 2010s, that's when you saw the intensification of the independence movement in Catalonia, trying to secede from Spain. And I thought, okay, I'll look at football a little bit and write about Football Club Barcelona. But then I discovered I was going to stay for 2 months, and I ended up staying for 2 years because I discovered a traditional sport, human tower building, which fascinated me because of its sensory, physical dimensions. And you know, Taussig, an anthropologist, called anthropology ethnography is embodied retelling, and that kind of embodiment, joining a team, being a human tower builder, performer myself, it attracted me a lot to have that kind of corporeal um, embodiment and mingling and mixing. So I joined the team and I stayed for 2 years. And of course, this was also interesting to me because this traditional sport, because it really got caught up with the independence movement in so many ways. It gave image, social base, and vocabulary to the independence movement, and it's one of these booming traditional sports. You had a handful of teams with the Francoist transformation, with the end of the dictatorship, and now you have more than 100 teams. So this is and of course the building metaphor and the bodies engaging in all this collaborative, collective, physical activity in a town square where you find pro-independence flags and claiming the right to vote. It was a very interesting instance for precisely how the political emerges through body movement.
And in between those two books, you co-edited with another noted sport studies star, Alan Berner, a couple of books.
Yes, we co-edited Sport and Secessionism, which convokes chapters on political context where certain regions are seeking independence, and how sport is mobilized for those purposes. So basically, we have looked at stateless nations. Alan worked a lot on questions of nationalism, and of course, my work in Spain departs from the stateless nation position, and how these regions are trying to negotiate more autonomy or independence, or outright secession from their states. And then we also edited another book which was called Indigenous, Traditional, and Folk Sports. And here we looked at diverse indigenous sports. I mean, our authors looked at diverse indigenous sports from all over the world. And our basic question was, what happened to indigenous forms of knowledge and indigenous voices through the story of their movement cultures? Of course, indigenous sports, traditional sports, kind of developed on the margins of modern sports, what we would call modern sports or hegemonic sports. These indigenous sports are often highly localized. They do not have international competitions, often not even national competitions, and yet they, in very important ways, capture the indigenous local imagination. And of course, as Western, where so-called modern sports tended to spread, and modern forms of pursuing sport started to spread out of Great Britain, these indigenous sports had an encounter with the modern systems, and we look at how they impacted each other.
These books sound fantastic, but what I'd like to ask you about a little bit in the time left to us, Prof, is your work that I've actually read, which is a few of your terrific articles. And the one about play in concentration camps, sports in concentration camps, which gives fantastic historical background to the horrors of Spain after the Civil War. And I know from my time living there that just as the Civil War in the United States has never ended, so big time the Spanish Civil War has never ended. There are people my age who have scars on their backs from where they were beaten by the fascist thugs in the early 70s. But there's also the site of resistance, of hope, of possibility, of trauma experienced by players, and in particular, the Basques, whom you focus on in the piece I read, because in addition to the evil work of Francoism over decades, before and since, there have been attempts to wipe out their language, wipe out their customs, often with Madrid in cahoots with the local ruling class. So it's a fascinating story. It's a wonderful article that you produced about this unlikely site of survival.
Yes, and I think that speaks to both cases, concentration camp, and then the basic question is, how is it possible that in such terrible places something like sport can survive? And then speaking of the Basque case and how sports, and for example this recruitment philosophy of the Basques, it kind of acted as an active resistance, although clandestinely imagined, against the dictatorship, right? And how sport has this ability, because even though it can be used, you can say, oh, it's the opium of the people, but then it really carries very real projections of selfhood from the perspective of the people. And I think it's possible because of the genre that it is, the play sphere. It's the play sphere is a kind of liminal genre, a liminal sphere, which is distinct from real life, as we say, right? The play sphere has its beginning, has its end, it has its rules, and that is how it's possible to imagine, Basques being on an equal footing with Spaniards during the dictatorship, because the play sphere stipulated a certain equivalence. In the play sphere, you have an initial chance of the same chance. You have an initial equivalence in the play sphere, and so that kind of liminal sphere allowed a kind of equivalence or equality to be imagined onto the situation, which of course was not present in the political realm.
With reference to the work about later times, Athletic Club de Bilbao, and so on, you refer to the situation experienced there as a double bind per Gregory Bateson. But couldn't it also be thought of as double consciousness per Du Bois? Not necessarily something fatally impossible, but something that is more a paradox than a contradiction?
Okay. The paradox and contradiction of identity, you mean?
Yes, that the contradiction felt with the Basques might be, I'm supposed to be Spanish, but I feel Basque, or vice versa. No. The paradox being more the Du Bois notion, which is that I have to be both at once, because I will always be seen as Black before I'm seen as American, but I feel American at the same time as I feel Black. Do you know what I mean?
Right. I think, yes, it comes down to this basic tension of who owns my identity, right? Can anyone own an identity? I think this is a very broad question for identity movements in general. Who gets to define it? We would like to think of us being, we define ourselves, our identities, but then people see us also in a certain way. And I think in Spain, regarding geopolitical projections, it was always a terrain of contention, how people are defined, whether, in Spain there's a high degree of autonomy in the autonomies now, but feelings are local, identifications are local. People are more readily say, well, I'm Basque in the Basque country, I'm Catalan, I'm Andalusian, and then they might say I'm also Spanish or not. And this is constantly, actually, there are proper surveys that monitor these sentiments, to what degree people feel only this, only that, or a mixture of the two. And it's a constant contestation. And one of the interesting things that sport brings into relief, and particularly national teams in a place like Spain, but also in Romania, I feel, and I will tell you about this. So is how is it that the kind of paradoxical situation where a national team, which represents a certain state, Spain, consists of, and even perhaps dominated by, players from regions which are positioned against Spain. And so we have seen players who have been expressly nationalistic, Catalan, Basque players, and yet they played for Spain. And we see it, for example, I did a little research on hockey, on a Hungarian minority in the Carpathians in Romania, where they have the same situation. The Romanian team, historically, there were a lot of tensions between Hungary and Romania ethnically. And the Romanian team consists of 90% Hungarian players, because that little enclave in the Carpathian is very strong in hockey. And those kinds of situations create a lot of conflicts and create a lot of narratives about who we are.
Wow, I've got to get hold of that piece. So,
I will send you everything.
I have one last question for you, if I may. And once you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you want. Could take the form of something entirely new we haven't discussed, or it might be that you want to traverse some terrain we've already covered, but make further remarks. Does that sound okay as means of bringing things to a close? Yeah. So my last question is about WAGs.
Oh.
This is, I think, not a concept well known in the United States. And
maybe now with Taylor Swift, it's getting more well known.
Can you tell us about the WAGs, wives and girlfriends, and this heterosexual jamboree and contest that goes on with reference to the presumptively heterosexual male sports star and his lover or wife, and in particular, the focus of your study?
Right. So WAGs, wives and girlfriends in elite football. That's the topic, and it came up first. This whole idea from the 2010 World Cup, which Spain won. And in the interview after the big win, the goalkeeper Casillas was interviewed by his own girlfriend, Sara Carbonero, who worked for a television channel. She was a legitimate journalist, but they also happened to be a couple, and she was asked to interview her new champion boyfriend, and he was also emotional, and he said, well, I want to thank everyone. And then he said, he just got so emotional. Well, I just kiss you and I go. And he kissed her and he left. And of course, this became the great celebrated romantic kiss of Spain. But before, what people forget is that Sara Carbonero had to suffer and endure constant strain of demonization, because Spain won the World Cup, but it didn't start with a win. It started with an embarrassing defeat from Switzerland. And so people started to attack Sara Carbonero and her presence at the World Cup as a journalist. She's distracting Iker Casillas, and look, he can't even catch an air ball. So the media ran through all these all these demonization about how her presence and her sexuality is distracting her man from the great cause of winning this title for the country. And then I looked into other cases, and of course, you know, the same happened to Shakira and Piqué, the same happened to Victoria Beckham and Beckham. So what you saw is this a kind of fear of the sexuality of the partner. And then I investigated I looked into what does this say about our idea of female sexuality. And I linked it to a sexual persona, the femme fatale, which is of course conceived of as this powerful woman who consumes her partner's energy. By the way, even Edith Piaf was considered was demonized because her big love was a boxer.
That's right, who died in a plane crash.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, Marcel. And even she was told by her coach, I read this in a biography, go easy on your champion because he has to be fresh on his knees. And so there's this constant pattern of demonization. And of course, there's a very strong cultural history of the femme fatale, of the fatal woman in film noir, in expressive culture. And I looked at how this economy plays out: sexuality, sport, and then production, which is a capitalist concept, the production of victories and goals, and how these three interact.
And I'm thinking of a couple of things here. First of all, Martin Scorsese's film Raging Bull, where the protagonist is not permitted to have sex prior to the big game in order to maintain his energy, but also the mythology surrounding another World Cup final, men's, involving the Netherlands. And this is 1974 against the Federal Republic of Germany, known as West Germany. And the mythology was that the Dutch were told, have sex the night before so you're relaxed. And the Germans were told, no girlfriends. Again, it's all assumed to be heterosexual. And of course, what happens? The Dutch score in the first minute and tire in the second half and lose. And this became the basis, true or not, for a lot of research since in terms of sex, sexual activity, and sporting performance. It goes on and on and on, this obsession. Just this week in the Winter Olympics in Italy, the fact that the number of condoms that were provided to athletes was insufficient after 3 days of a 2-week tournament. These things have become absolute obsessions, it seems to me. And so often the female body is held responsible for the performance of the male body. So I think it's a great study and wonderful work.
Yes. As far as I know, there is no conclusive study about the impact of having sex on sport performance. But just as a funny anecdote, I teach sport and society this semester, and in my class, there are some football players, American football players, and we were discussing these questions. This whole question that you're asking, it all came up. And one of my students asked one of the football players, so what's happening? What do you say? He said, 2 days. He didn't say anything else, meaning the coach, you know, they observed the 2-day abstinence. And it entirely speaks to the ritual nature of the sport event, right? Where in the ritual process, you have a certain separation from your previous life. You have a separation from your family, from your girlfriend. That's why athletes sleep as a group in a hotel. They are separated even when they play home games.
Well, because we got from desire specifically to sex. We've run the gambit successfully. I'm wondering whether there's anything you'd like to add. And as I said, it might be something we haven't touched on, or it could be further remarks on something that we did discuss.
We discussed a lot, that's for sure. I think I just kind of we peripherally alluded to ethnography, methodology, and it comes up because the podcast I listened to from you was on the attention movement, which is such a fact. And you also mentioned how there's this quick churning out of articles, and we are required in academia to just work so fast and produce so fast, and this is a malaise of the time, right? This urgency. And what I like about ethnography, if I think of it, is precisely that it's kind of an antidote to this attention loss or attention deficit. You still have to spend a lot of time with your subjects. You have to learn languages, which needs time. You have to build rapport, and it's a slow cooking, longue durée genre, which I'm hoping that in sports studies where we operate, they start appreciating more, because it is true that people go to some place for a weekend and they publish about it, a journal article, and that's it. And really, I'm a big proponent of the ethnographic genre, and I know that in academia, and particularly European anthropology, it's a concerning tendency that there's this push towards journal articles. But I'm a book person. I will continue to write the longue durée ethnographies. So I'm hoping that this kind of fast-paced, also AI written by now, AI challenged research scenario where we are, it's not going to make the ethnography go away, and this kind of embodied retelling that ethnography is.
Those are very wise words with which to perorate, Prof. Again, thank you so much. I've learned a huge amount from your work, which is brilliant. And I'd love to go and watch football with you. I don't want to climb a human tower with you.
You don't have to climb it. You can just be in the base.
I mean, they claim
But
only
let's do
one
it.
person's ever died, right? Or something. Isn't this the myth?
Yeah, there have been deaths. That's one of the challenges of this practice. It's so popular, and a lot of people, 1,000 people build one. That's a lot of bodies and a lot of weight. And
You want me to
safety
be
is
on the
now a
bottom?
main concern.
You want me down the bottom?
You can be on a more peripheral place, which are kind of safer. So.
Thank you so much.
But let's do it.
It was wonderful getting the chance to chat to you. And as I say, I've learned so much from your written work, and now I've learned from listening to you as well.
Likewise, I admire your work and its volume and its diversity.